Welcome to SIIMCast, a podcast brought to you by the Society for Imaging Informatics in Medicine.
Welcome to another episode of SIIMCast. This is Jason, and in this episode, we continue our mini-series in the exploration of the Practical Imaging Informatics textbook. This is where we interview authors about the chapters that they contributed to, and today we're honored to have Dr. Jim Whitfill with us to explore Chapter 8 that focuses on data security and patient privacy. Dr. Whitfill brings his vast expertise in healthcare leadership, strategy, and digital care to this discussion. As Chief Transformation Officer at Honor Health, he has led significant efforts in creating innovative digital platforms and advancing healthcare delivery. Dr. Whitfill also serves as Clinical Associate Professor at the University of Arizona College of Medicine, Phoenix, and has been a pivotal figure in the Society of Imaging Informatics in Medicine. In this episode, we delve into the nuances of data security and patient privacy, exploring the fine line between the two and understanding their implications in the modern healthcare landscape. Dr. Whitfill shares valuable insights on the evolving threats of cybercrime, the financial incentives driving these crimes, and the critical measures healthcare organizations must adopt to safeguard patient information. We also discuss the complexities of regulatory environments across different regions and the challenges faced by healthcare providers in complying with these regulations. Tune in for an episode filled with expert knowledge, real-world examples, and actionable insights. I hope you enjoy. Today, we are honored to have Dr. Jim Whitfill with us, who is the author of Chapter 8 of the Practical Imaging Informatics Resource Textbook. And the topic is on data security and patient privacy. Thank you for joining us today. And to start things off, your topic is on data security and patient privacy. And maybe we can draw some clear lines around a distinction between what is patient privacy and what is data security in the context of healthcare.
Well, Jason, it's a really great question. And we may have some challenges drawing really clear lines, but let's explore the topic and see where it takes us. Because certainly there's tremendous overlaps between these two concepts. But some of the ways that I think about this, maybe we'll just run through some sort of examples, would be imagine a scenario where a healthcare organization of some sort, whether it was like a retail pharmacy chain or integrated healthcare delivery system or any others, has patient data that's held in an incredibly secure manner and in a way that outside, it's hard to exfiltrate it or get it out or steal it. But nonetheless, that entity, this would be strange for someone to do, probably unethical, but imagine that entity now takes that data and starts to, in an anonymized way, develops machine learning models, right, to be able to understand propensities of certain customers, for example. So that might be a situation where we've got tremendous data security. The risk of a cyber attack is low, but the patient's privacy is being, violated in the sense that their unredacted or their identifiable data is sort of running into sort of the machine learning models. And so one of the things that we'll talk a little bit later about different regulatory environments, while the two they certainly overlap, and here's an example where they would. Let's take that same retail pharmacy organization. If there were to be a cyber attack and data was removed from the organization, then all of those patients' privacy is about to be violated. In fact, we'll talk a little bit later about some of the terrible kinds of crime that we're seeing now, is where not only is there a sort of a first wave of a cyber attack, but usually there's like an extortion where patients' data is leaked onto the dark web. And obviously we have tremendous violations of both.
So you've mentioned extortion. I can't remember how long ago it was, probably about a decade and a half ago, there was a talk, not at SIIM, but it was a talk, and the person was discussing cyber attacks at that time were fairly low, and was talking about how health records, there wouldn't be a lot of incentivized nature of obtaining this. There wouldn't be a lot of value in that. And we've seen, the contrary since then. And so I wanted to, maybe we could talk a little bit more about what are these financial incentives and the risks involved for cyber criminals, that are targeting these things. And you mentioned extortion over the years.
Unfortunately, one of the brightest economic spots that I know of is in cybercrime. I mean, the ability to, with a very small investment, make tons of money. We're talking about ROIs, return on investments of 100x, 1000x, just with some pretty small investments in what's called malware software that's used for sort of nefarious purposes. So if we think about the financial incentives for cybercrime, they fall into a couple of buckets. First of all, just as you mentioned, there's been an evolution where maybe in the distant past, health records were not seen as valuable. But if you just go on to dark web, just for our audience, is almost like a parallel internet. So we use web browsers to surf what I would call the public internet. We use search engines like Google, but there's a whole parallel infrastructure of sort of a network-based environment where there's drugs, weapons, malware. I mean, sort of all sort of types of criminal element, human trafficking. It's a terrible place. But that is sort of the transactional layer where a lot of this stuff goes on. And in that space, healthcare records are the most valuable types of records that you can sell. And oftentimes probably worth maybe 50 to 100 times more than, say, stolen social security numbers or credit cards. And it's for a couple of reasons. Credit card numbers get canceled really quickly. They're not very durable. Social security numbers have been breached so many times. They're relatively, I mean, it's terrible to say this, but they're relatively common. But healthcare records let you do two things from a criminal perspective. Number one, you can submit false healthcare claims. And we've seen this in Medicare is frequently a victim of fraud where you can submit false claims to an insurance payer. It takes them a while to figure out that there's crime going on. And by that time, you can kind of move on. So false claims is one. And then it's ripe for identity theft. So if you think about a medical record, all of the demographic information that comes with it, you generally have everything that you need in order to steal somebody's identity, which itself then can lead to other types of sort of valuable revenue for these kind of criminals. So that's been a big change to records themselves. Jason, there's a ton more. Do we need to take a break or can I keep going on this one?
No, you keep going. Maybe I'll throw something in and I'd love to get your thoughts on this because one of the things I heard was the opportunity of having a ransomware as a service. So you have organizations, and I may not have any interest in participating in crime, but I might get poked by an organization to just install some malware and I'll get a commission or something. I don't know. Have you come across that yourself?
I haven't myself, but in my research, there are definitely, there's a whole parallel marketplace, just like, so in imaging informatics, we oftentimes have this argument, should we have a best of breed? Like, do you have a RIS from one vendor, a PACS from another vendor, maybe an EMR from a third vendor, and billing from a fourth? Or do you want to go, with one vendor who kind of does everything? Guess what? There's the exact same debate, in the malware space. You can buy individual components, like one set of things to sort of get you into an organization, another set of tools that can let you move laterally once you're in there, or maybe you just like to work with, one vendor. And you can do it you can either buy the software, you can actually farm out sort of the human work of, like, I might own the software, I might farm out to an organized crime piece to actually do the extortion because I don't want to get my hands dirty. It's really all of the vibrancy that you would see in any other market, you definitely see here. What that does is it lowers the barrier of entry that, sort of makes it pretty easy to get in. And we'll talk about this a little bit more. That being said, the most dangerous cyber attacks generally come from nation states, and because they just have levels of resources that, yes, you can have ransomware as a service, but you're dwarfed by, a really motivated nation state.
I'm curious if there's ever been studies on correlation between, we see increasing inflation, we see, the cost of living has increased, and these types of attacks, the barrier of entry is a lot lower, you said. So I wonder if there's a correlation between the two where you could see the increase being tied to that.
It's an interesting question. It definitely, we've seen that as the availability of a couple of things have been driving cybercrime. Number one is certainly the availability of these tools. this might upset people because they're folks that are Bitcoin evangelists. But the reality is the widespread trading and availability of distributed ledger tools like Bitcoin, it's almost designed for criminal activities like this. And obviously it can be used for other purposes as well. But its biggest use, and it's really accelerated the use of cybercrime because it's not impossible to trace, but it's hard to trace. And so those have been big pieces. But the other thing that I think more than inflation or whatnot, just the willingness to pay that organizations have, and criminals, it's almost like a lesson in microeconomics. Criminals are testing, always, it's like an auction, like how much is somebody going to pay? And the word gets around like, oh, we went after this industry. They paid us a ton. More people go in and they go after that industry. Turns out that healthcare, in addition for all the other things we talked about, healthcare organizations tend to pay well, right? And why do we pay well? Not because we're trying to foster cybercrime, but because we're dealing with people's lives. And if you're a leader of a hospital and you're trying to decide, do I stand on principle and not pay, a ransom, or while I have patients queuing up in the emergency department, my throughput's down to like 10% of normal. Like that is a really tough situation to be in. And so criminals are smart. They see where's the money, and the amount of ransom paid keeps going up, and they keep testing what's the upper limit.
That's incredible. That's very interesting. I have a few other thoughts on that. I'm just wondering if I should keep going further. Or
I think you should.
Yeah, no, it's interesting on that perspective as far as like what people will pay. I think people would be shocked as far as, we hear about certain healthcare organizations that make the newspapers, but I think that there's a lot of payments that get delivered and things that are happening that, with across healthcare organizations that we just don't know about. And so this is being handled. Organizations want to handle it within closed doors and keep this shut. I guess my question is, when you go down the path of paying, what do you see as far as the experience of the ethics of these cyber criminals and not going back and having like a second malware attempt a week later?
Wow, this is a really fun question. And I'll tell you two examples, what some of the data suggests, and then an anecdote that goes against what the data suggests. And what that just tells you is sometimes it's hard to give you 100% sort of guarantee what's going to happen. But the data suggests that in general, that when a ransom is asked for and you pay for it, about 90% of the time, the cyber criminals will provide you with a key to sort of unlock your data. And about 90% of the time, those keys work. So what does that tell you? It tells you that most of the time, actually, the criminals will sort of honor what they are asking for. Some have argued, John Riggi, who's at the American Hospital Association, formerly with the FBI, is a really powerful national speaker on this topic. He notes that a number of these cyber groups have a brand image that they're trying to maintain, right? And so they want everybody to know, if you pay us, we're going to deliver so that the next person will pay. That being said, if we look at the most recent Change Healthcare attack, and at least what is reported to have happened, we see a new development, which is kind of concerning. It's believed that Optum paid probably north of $20 million of ransom, which would be one of the largest ransoms ever paid, in order to sort of decrypt the Change data. Then there was some kind of faction split within the cyber criminal group that had done the attack. And the group that took the money or received the money was now split off from a different part of the group. And the part that split off felt like they had not received their fair share or any of the ransom. So what did they do? They went back, allegedly, to Optum and said, if you don't pay us the same amount of money again, you might have decrypted your data, but we're going to leak all of the data that we stole onto the dark web, as I mentioned. So, Jason, there's this new phenomena of what's kind of called like a 1-2 punch. First, there's an extortion to decrypt your data. And then there can be a second wave, either because, let's say you have great backups and you say, I'm not going to pay you to decrypt my data because I have another way of getting at it. The group may say, fine, we're going to extort you to keep us from leaking it on the dark web. That's a single punch that could go in two ways, or the double punch of what we saw in Change Healthcare. So what it tells you is, even though cyber criminals generally pay, there's no guarantee, there's no honor amongst thieves, I guess is like the old saying goes, right?
And you said that in most cases, these are nation states. So in, I guess, the minority, it's teenagers or whatever, people Is that the case in what we're seeing here, do you think, or as reported?
I'll amend that. Probably didn't speak super clear. So the most sophisticated attacks are by nation states. And so not necessarily as a percentage, although there's a lot of organized crime, and it is oftentimes affiliated with a nation state. So we believe that the Change Healthcare attack, for example, is with an organized crime group that has strong ties to Russia. So you get these blurry lines of, you might have nation states that are launching attacks themselves, and then we have organized crime units that might be affiliated or connected to nation states. And then, like you said, then we have just, we'll call it regular criminals, regular organized criminals on their own. And so you can kind of see across the spectrum. But the nation states tend to be the hardest to stop if they're motivated.
Wow. Okay. So on that note, let's pivot a little bit.
Yeah.
We'll move over to privacy. There's different regulations and according to the region that you might be part of. So there's HIPAA, GDPR. I'm in Canada. And so provincially in Ontario, we have PIIRT. And then, in Manitoba, I think it's FIA or something like that. So I'm curious if you could talk about just how regulations differ in their approaches to data security and patient privacy, and what challenges do healthcare providers face in complying with these types of regulations?
And this could probably be a whole talk unto itself. It is a fascinating and pretty complex area. So I think about a couple of dimensions when I think about these different regulations. One is the dimension of time. And GDPR, for example, is a much newer regulation than, say, HIPAA. And because our concepts of the maybe vulnerability of personal information has evolved over time, that's led to differences in these regulations. By the way, another layer you could put on that's now in the EU, but not yet in the States or I believe Canada, would be kind of approaches to AI. It's not the same, but it's in that sort of same space. And so in general, what we've seen is the EU has been very sensitive to personal information that is being obtained or harvested or captured and not having explicit consent from people to share it. So oftentimes there are a lot of safe harbors. For example, HIPAA, much older rule, began to think a lot around the privacy of health information, not the broad category of personal information. Health information is sort of like a subcategory of that. But HIPAA gives a lot of room for exchange of information for treatment decisions and care pieces. So, for example, if you're a patient, your surgeon and your radiologist and your primary care physician are allowed to talk to each other and share information because they're treating you, right? We don't put boundaries around that. It's more if we're going to take that information and deliver it to a third party, not for purposes of either delivering care or the billing of it. GDPR, however, has taken, and really, I think, heavily influenced by the development of the internet and all of the data being collected either by websites or different web applications. Think about, tracking mechanisms that are in either retail websites or mapping tools or whatnot. And what we learned from this is that there's huge amounts of data that was able to be kind of harvested from people who were using these tools. Oftentimes that data was remonetized in other ways. And the EU, I think, adds judgment to it, but I think the EU came out and said, look, this, people need to explicitly know if their personal information is being tracked and reused in other places. So you start to see these different attitudes. But again, I think it's the fact that you had that time element. It was a time and cultural elements. And obviously Europeans, by the fact that the AI laws that they've already passed showed that Europe tends to be much more sensitive to these concepts of protecting personal information, whereas the US might have been early with HIPAA, has always taken kind of more of a hands-off approach or a more limited approach, at least in this case, to being just in the space of healthcare.
There is, I forget which day it is, but at the upcoming annual meeting at SIIM, there is a talk on the AI Act. And so that should be interesting. It's about, the European legislation and how that might impact things. I don't know too much about it. I don't want to put you on the spot. Is that something that you're familiar with at all that you'd like to comment on?
I'll comment carefully on it. I think that I make the following observations. If you think about three big powers that are working in the AI space, China, obviously, and the US, there's really kind of a Cold War or arms race going on between the two of them in terms of being able to develop AI capabilities. I think, if you just look at research papers alone, trying to make this like non-judgmental, Europe has largely lagged, in the AI space. So it's interesting that Europe being very sensitive to personal information, as we already talked about from GDPR, it makes sense that if they would come out sort of first, in terms of their regulatory environment. To be honest, it's really what is China and the US going to do, which probably really matters a lot more because there's so much AI development there. Then you get into some interesting pieces. The US is starting to struggle with the fact that we're having certain states coming forward and proposing their own state laws, which then makes, in the US, that could be really challenging to have different sort of technology related laws simply because it's hard to confine technology to a particular state border. I'm going to guess that China is never going to, be super worried about, the personal information that's in their AI. So long story short is I think it is very interesting because I think that there are people in the US looking at the EU laws as maybe something to copy. So it's an important sort of flag that's been planted out there. I think it has that flag planting effect is probably the biggest piece of it because, again, most of AI research is being done in China and the US.
The legislation, it's a chicken and the egg thing. So the legislation somewhat is being motivated by the environment, so maybe a lack of AI adoption or whatever. And now you see an opportunity for legislation that's going to come out and potentially would be adopted in other regions. I do find it funny. I'm from English heritage and I never hear the end of my relatives reminding me that AI was invented in England, but you don't see any innovation since then. So as far as development goes, wide speaking statement, sorry.
Alan Turing's probably turning over his grave thinking about this.
Yes, exactly. So moving on, what would you say makes certain healthcare systems particularly vulnerable or attractive targets for cyber criminals? And what are the most common types of attacks? You've touched on this a bit as the how free these tools are, but what do we typically see as a primary attack that these organizations might face?
Well, by far, we continue to see ransomware being the largest type of attack. And just for our listeners, the idea of what ransomware is that a cyber criminal gains access to a hospital network or a health system network, and they fly under the radar. So they're undetected, usually for weeks or months. And while they're in that environment, they do a couple of things. They start to install software on different computer systems, ideally like servers, but also PCs. And that software sort of gets set so that it can then encrypt all of the storage on the device. And when a switch is thrown, once that data is encrypted, now all of a sudden the regular operating system and applications can't use it anymore. And the systems become unusable. So, by the way, while the cyber criminals are in your network installing this, they're usually doing things like reading your email. So they understand, things like they can even find out like how much insurance do you have. So if I know that you have a $20 million policy, you can be pretty sure that the ransom request is probably going to be like 19.5 million. It's going to be really close to what your policy limits are. More concerningly, by monitoring those internal communication traffics, you can find out what are a company's backup systems. Like, how do they do their backups? Are there some of their backups that are held kind of in what's called immutable or write once, read many kind of format that's supposed to be, harder to attack. But if you know that it's there, right, that you can go looking for it. So in general, ransomware is by far the biggest type of attack that we're seeing on health systems. And some of the reasons, if you think about healthcare, number one, we generally have most large integrated healthcare delivery systems have very narrow operating margins. More than half in the US are now losing money. So budgets are incredibly tight and it's hard to allocate, if you're trying to decide between, say, a new radiation therapy machine that maybe just, I'm making this up, it can add 6 months of life to a group of people who have a certain kind of cancer. Do I invest in that? Or do I invest in, maybe an intrusion detection system that, is going to help me try to find cyber criminals? Obviously, in a perfect world, you would do both. But if you have to choose between those two and you've got growing health needs in a community, it can be hard to make those allocations. So that's one. The other thing is we see that there's been a lot of merger and acquisition activity in healthcare. So oftentimes the technology environments are incredibly complex. The last piece is, so you might have different systems that have been brought together. And a lot of us in imaging know this. So for example, if you have an MRI machine that has a PC embedded in it and it's running an operating system from 12, 15 years ago, the MRI may still be usable, right? The operating system may have been end of life a long time ago, but last time I shopped, MRIs are not cheap, right? So just because the PC has an out-of-date operating system, are you going to spend $3 million to get a new, MRI? And so now that leaves you with, it's not just MRIs. Oftentimes there's software applications running in healthcare organizations that don't have modern equivalents. And so they're running on older equipment. So and then patching can be a real challenge. Oftentimes, all of us have stories of where we've taken medical devices offline when we've deployed, sometimes just scanning your network with a cyber, a tool like Tenable can be enough to knock sort of fragile medical devices offline. So you've got this incredibly complex environment, lots of vulnerabilities, sensitivity, and we're trying not to interfere with clinical care. And that makes it just really, really challenging to protect.
I remember in the not too distant past, there was people use stories about USB keys being left in the parking lots and people, putting them in their laptops. And that was the entering point for the malware. And now there's, like phishing exercises that we'll go through and so on. I'm curious, you touched on the budgeting a bit, and just as you're assessing, do I buy this medical equipment or do I buy intrusion detection software? Where does insurance fit in as far as what we're seeing now lately? I have some experience with this a couple of years ago, and it was getting quite intense as far as approval for, cybersecurity coverage. Any comments as far as what you're seeing?
Absolutely. So for people not in the industry, they may assume, oh, you don't need to worry about intrusion detection systems or patching or whatever. Just go buy insurance and you'll be fine. But cyber insurance has become a lot like trying to buy flood insurance in Florida. I mean, it's just people, like most insurance companies, are leaving the space, or the amount of scrutiny that you have to go through as an organization to get the insurance is material. So for a lot of organizations, they are unable to get cyber insurance anymore. In general, when you apply or you're trying to buy it, you're going to go through really rigorous audits, higher, by the way, than say if you're in the US, from like a regular HIPAA security assessment. Oftentimes really in-depth questions around how you do your backups, what your business continuity pieces are, a bunch of different areas. So cyber insurance has gotten to be very, very challenging to obtain, number one. And then the other piece that's interesting is that when you look at the losses that have come from places like Common Spirit or Scripps, in general, these cyber attacks cause hundreds of millions of dollars in damage. At best, the cyber policies cover $20 to $30 million. So even if you can get them, they oftentimes are probably only covering less than 30% of your total losses. So long story short, if you can get cyber insurance, not a bad thing. It's good to have, but certainly you don't want to count on it at all as your solitary weapon against this problem.
I'm curious, you've touched on this a bit as far as, maybe not buying the medical equipment because you need the intrusion software. That's an impact to, the patient care potentially that an organization might see. What are some other examples on how cyber attacks have directly attacked patient health that you've seen?
So there are a couple of ways that you can look at this, and there's starting to be a little bit more literature about it. So number one, we know that starting with the WannaCry attack that hit the National Health Service, but this has been repeated at Scripps, UVM, Common Spirit. If you look at a health system when it loses all of its technology capabilities, the throughput in that system drops dramatically, probably about 90%. So oftentimes, all elective procedures, all outpatient care, all stops. And really, you revert to you're managing patients in your emergency department. Your ORs are only doing emergency cases. So you think about, we've seen that there have been several cases of delayed, maybe not total emergencies, but patients with coronary artery disease would have, unstable angina, which is just the blockages are about to come, or they have, critical valve disease, or patients who have an infected foot, like with diabetes, and they're running the risk of getting a system-wide infection. So there's definitely cases where there's a lot of delay in care that happens from that throughput. Another interesting paper that came out that looked at, I believe it was the Scripps event, started to look at, let's say you have 4 hospital systems in a city and one hospital gets attacked. The other 3 hospitals are also impacted, because what happens is all of the patients who can't go to the impacted hospital now start to flood the other open hospitals. And what we've seen is that the amount of time patients spend what's called boarding in the emergency department goes way up. We know that boarding in the emergency department is associated with a number of poor clinical outcomes because you just don't have the same level of supervision that you do on the floor. So that would be another example of patient health impact. A really fascinating one would be the opposite. There's a paper that suggested that after an organization has had a cyber attack, if you look at the next 2 years, there's an increase, it looks like, in mortality from heart attacks in those hospitals. And it's believed to be that all of the additional sort of security measures that get put in place post-attack become barriers to care, right? It's either harder to get in, there's a bunch of things, right? And we've all experienced that, there's always a trade-off between convenience and security. And so there is some data that suggests that all of those countermeasures that we tend to put into place may also impact patient health. So long story short is this is not a compliance issue. This really does impact our patients. And there are great examples in all of these different parts of the literature.
Yeah, I've often heard the example of like privacy and security. You have ones that want to build bridges and then ones that, they end up building walls. And when you build those walls, it completely defeats the full use case that we're actually trying to achieve, which is for patient care. Turning a bit our attention around the access controls. And I was wondering if you could tell us, like, how do network access control systems help in securing the healthcare networks, and what are the key differences between promiscuous and non-promiscuous DICOM devices?
Let's start with the super easy one, and the one really relevant to our listeners being at SIM, the difference between promiscuous and non-promiscuous DICOM device settings. So if anybody has ever done modality integration, right, you get a brand new MRI machine or ultrasound or DR unit. As you set it up on your network, there's a couple of things you have to think about. Number one, just in your network, is that device allowed to talk to, say, wherever your PAC system is? Increasingly, we see, I'm not yet at the promiscuous, non-promiscuous piece, but we'll kind of use modality integration as a way to kind of explore this. 20, 30 years ago, most computer networks and health systems were such that if you plug something into an Ethernet jack, it's allowed to talk to anything else. As long as you had the right IP address and the right routing information, right, anything could kind of talk to anything. That made it super easy. New device, plug it in, it's on the network, it's working. Now all I'd have to do is go into the device itself and tell it, where the DICOM destination is, and everything would work from there. There's 2 layers of security that we think about now. Number one is in the network itself. Oftentimes now we have, at the most extreme, something called zero trust architecture, which essentially says it assumes that even inside an organization, nothing is allowed to talk to anything else unless it's explicitly allowed, as opposed to the old days, which was like anything could talk to anything unless you explicitly blocked it. The similar piece exists at the DICOM level. So when you're configuring a DICOM node, you can essentially say, is this node allowed to receive any DICOM data set that comes in, from anywhere, or do I have to have the AE title? Do we have to explicitly say I'm only going to accept DICOM information that comes in from an AE title that I've already registered? So promiscuous, which I always thought was like a really great term, promiscuous would be a DICOM node that I can take any device, send a DICOM object to it, and it will accept it, it will ingest it, it'll read the metadata, it'll store the image. A non-promiscuous DICOM node will only accept an incoming DICOM object if it's been explicitly allowed sort of by its AE title. So that's a way of securing things to make sure that an archive or a PAC system or web sharing or whatever else you want is essentially only going to receive DICOM objects. But I will tell you, in the meantime, at the network level, most organizations have gone and taken sort of that same idea and said, let's be really careful around what devices and networks are allowed to talk to other networks. And that kind of gets into the whole network access control. So at a third layer, even at the individual level, so we might control, most of us now are designing our computer networks in a way that we assume we are being breached or going to be breached. And so what you want to do is make it so it's really hard. You might be able to get into the library at, hospital B, but it doesn't matter that you're in the library at hospital B. You can't really get very far outside of that. And hopefully we find you in the library, but before you get to that. So whether it's VLANs are an older way of being able to sort of segment out our network. And increasingly, there are sophisticated sort of software monitoring tools that are looking at traffic and essentially trying to make sure that we really confine it to individual parts of our health systems. What that means, though, if you're a PACS administrator, imaging informatics professional, your life is probably a lot harder because now 2 weeks before a modality comes, you've got to file in a ticket with the network team to let them know, like, I need this jack turned on, and this is going to be the IP address, and it has to, like, what are the ports that it's going to use, and what IP addresses does it need to reach, and all of that has to be done. And if it's not done, your modality may show up. You're not going to get anything working until all that's taken care of.
Okay. Yeah, no, lots to consider. I was wondering, as we think about network access control, what are some other effective strategies that healthcare organizations can put in to protect against phishing? And we haven't really touched on this yet, but social engineering is a big challenge. There was a big breach that happened recently, and I'm trying to remember, it was a fake phone call that allowed them to get in. And so just curious your thoughts about implementing strategies that can help prevent this.
Yeah, it is. This is so depressing. It's a build a better mousetrap, get a better mouse kind of phenomenon. So certainly, if we think about phishing remains one of the top ways that organizations get access into a network. So, we all watch the movies and you think about people trying to find software vulnerabilities, so-called zero-day vulnerabilities, hacking into the computer system. But the reality is, by far the most effective way to do it is what's called social engineering. And just that means pretending to be somebody that you're not. And so common things that I think everybody's aware of, but it's worth reminding folks, is you receive an email that looks really similar to a normal email from Microsoft or eBay or Amazon or your payroll department from your own hospital. And it says something to the effect of, we've had to reset your password. Please click here, enter your old password and enter a new password, something like that. What you don't realize is the link that you're clicking is not to the organization that you think it is. It is actually to a cyber criminal who then harvests your username and password. Now they have those two pieces of information. Makes it a lot easier for them to break in to a computer network. The way we try to mitigate against that is, and I think everybody's seen this in the last couple of years, is the adoption of what's called multi-factor authentication, MFA. So MFA is, you have something that might be your username and password, but then something you have, which would be some kind of code or token that changes. So commonly we've seen where you put in your username, password, and you'll get a text message onto your smart device. That text message has a 6-digit code that changes over time, and you can enter that in. And it's only with the username, password, and the code can you actually get into a computer network. That helps a lot. And in fact, we know that the Change Healthcare attack was based on a social engineering-based phish where there was not multi-factor authentication in place. There is now. They've now put that across other systems. The challenge is multi-factor authentication can be thwarted as well. And I'm not even going to tell the audience how that happens because, it's still early enough that I think keeping that obscure. But the problem is it is not a slam dunk. And usually what I would tell people is the more concerned you are around, securing something personal, text-based items are probably easier to attack than others. So if you can use an application-based multi-MFA like Microsoft Authenticator, Google Authenticator, Duo, there's a bunch of them that are out there. Those are probably safer than text-based, but text-based SMS is better than nothing.
I'm curious if you have thoughts about where AI will fit into the social engineering with deepfake videos and audio.
I'm really worried about it. I'm published in cybersecurity, and I have fallen like twice in my life for a fish. I think actually once in my life. But when that happened, I was like, I couldn't believe it because like I write on this stuff. And the reality is when you're super busy, super stressed, you don't have enough time, you're processing information very quickly, you can make a bad judgment. That becomes so much more vulnerable if you are able to generate, generative AI can make an image that looks like anything, right? So I think that's going to really make this much more challenging. Another interesting kind of criminal activity that we've seen sort of related to this is we have 15,000 people that work for our health system. It's not uncommon for someone to get a text message from a cyber criminal purporting to be our hospital CEO saying, hey, Jim, I need you to go out and buy $300 worth of Apple cards. I'm in the middle of a really important meeting. I can't get it right now, but I need you to do this. Now, I work with our CEO on a daily basis. I know that they would never, ever do that. But if you're like just a frontline person and you've never even met the CEO, you don't know, you get something like this and your blood pressure goes up. You're like, oh my gosh, this is important. Like this is for me. And that's for a pretty, poorly disguised, attack. I think that AI is going to allow us to do, you could imagine sort of like getting a phone call where, somebody's voice has been cloned, all of which is very doable today from, companies like 11 Labs. And generative AI is going to make our ability to distinguish reality from falsehood just really, really tough.
It's going to be fun. Yeah. Just to make you feel any better, at my previous organization, we had a phishing exercise and I was the only one that fell for it. So I clicked on the link. So unfortunately, it's easy to fall for when you're busy and you go through these things. And just as your point goes, AI is going to make this all the more harder. We're kind of touching on this now about emerging threats with AI and all that. Have anything further to go about where the emerging threats might go, or?
If we add in this concept of generative AI and promiscuous DICOM elements, there are published attacks, quote, in the lab. These haven't happened in the wild, but we've seen where, imagine you have a CT scanner and you have a PACS archive. You can take a device, you can go into a hospital, and assuming that the network doesn't have robust access controls, and assuming that the DICOM node is promiscuous, you can put a device on the network. And so when the CT scan sends its image in, you basically grab it off the network and you can use an adversarial network to come up with, you can, for example, introduce pulmonary nodules into that CT scan and then send it on into the archive. So what does that tell you? That says that now with sort of advanced AI capabilities, I can start to change the fundamental appearance of an image. And a radiologist, when we've done tests, a lot of the times the radiologist can't tell the difference. They can't tell that the image has been altered up to like 70 to 80% of the time. So like, you're like, well, why would anybody ever do that? Well, again, I don't love talking about this, but imagine the ransom capability, right? So if I were to do that into a hospital, I was to say, look, I've polluted 10% of your archive. You don't know which 10% it is, but if you don't pay me $10 million, right, I'm going to leave that in there. And you're going to have patients who are going to, have false diagnoses start to show up. And guess what? People would probably, pay to avoid that. So, we definitely can see, if we come back to this concept, cyber criminals are going to look for the easiest way to make the most money. AI is just going to fuel that in kind of coming up with new ways to sort of create situations that people will pay lots of money to get out of. And that's how we need to be thinking from a cybersecurity perspective.
Thanks. Earlier on, you talked about intrusion detection systems. Maybe we can go a little further on that and talk about honeypots and how they work in healthcare cybersecurity and what roles do they play?
Yeah, I think of, like, I'm a doctor. So when you're a doctor, everything is healthcare, right? If you think about the human body and the way that we protect ourselves from disease, like germs, viruses, bacteria, and whatnot, we have layers in that kind of our defensive system. So we have our skin. Our skin actually keeps out a ton of stuff because for the most part, inside our body is sterile, outside our body is covered in a bunch of things. So just having a nice barrier around is really helpful. The equivalent in hospital systems would be we have firewalls, right? So we segment out the internet from inside an organization, and that barrier is really helpful. Like there's every hospital firewall today is being pounded, thousands of times a minute with attempts to scan, attack, people trying to look in. So that first barrier is really important. But the reality is bacteria are going to get into our body and hackers are going to get into a hospital system. So we have an immune system. Our immune system is constantly sort of like marching around, like looking for a virus that's gotten into our body. And when it sees one, it starts to respond. Our immune system doesn't assume no one will ever get in. It assumes that people are going to get in. And when they do, its job is to respond as fast as possible. And what intrusion detection systems are, they're monitoring systems inside the firewall and assuming that people are going to breach. Ideally, you want to keep everybody out, but you're assuming some people are going to get in. And what you want to be able to do is find them quickly once they get in. Because as I mentioned, the typical cyber criminal will spend weeks or months even inside your network doing a couple of things. Surveillance, learning about you. They also tend to do what's called exfiltration. Exfiltration just means they start just sucking what looks to be important data out. Because remember, that important data, they'll extort you for it later, or maybe they'll just steal it if it's intellectual property or whatnot. So intrusion detection systems can do things like they're monitoring the logs across huge numbers of machines. So routers, switches, servers, PCs, because in general, there tends to be, when people are inside your network, there are footprints that are being left. But if you don't have the right system to be able to extract that, it's like a needle in the haystack. The needle's there. You don't know how to look for it. And so IDSs can help you search for those things. Honeypots are a creative way of saying, like, all right, I'm going to assume that somebody's going to be in my network. I'm going to create a trap, or I'm going to create a digital object, like it's going to be a server or an application, and it's going to look so attractive that a criminal is going to want to go there first when they break in. But I'm going to set it up so that as soon as somebody like walks into or accesses the honeypot, it sets off alarms. So it's like saying, I'm assuming somebody's going to break into my house. They're going to get through the burglar alarm on the perimeter, but I'm going to put like a pot of gold, sitting in my den. But the pot of gold will have lasers all around it. So as soon as you break in the house, you're like, oh my God, this guy was an idiot. He left gold in his den. I'm going to get the gold. And as soon as you get the gold, it sets off the alarm. It's almost like the phishing in the opposite way. Like they're designed to be so exciting to the hacker that they go right for it and then sort of announce themselves.
I keep thinking of Winnie the Pooh here. This has been a great conversation. I'm definitely going to steal that analogy of the body as the intrusion detection system. I really like that. Maybe we could close out and just talk about what are the critical lessons that a healthcare organization should learn and implement to improve their cybersecurity.
I think there are a couple of really important takeaways, maybe three that I'll focus on. The first is, and we talked about this a little bit before, oftentimes organizations are struggling to decide whether to invest in cybersecurity or other medical devices or even information technology components. One of the most important things I believe for an organization to do is have cybersecurity report outside of IT. And in general, with high-level access to the board, it is too easy to ignore cybersecurity weaknesses in the short term, but they come back to bite you in the long term. So number one, think about a structure where cybersecurity is not reporting through IT. It really should be outside of IT. IT is an important partner, but it's much more helpful to be able to have them more as sort of controls against each other rather than in the same place, number one. Number two, we talked about multi-factor authentication. Multi-factor authentication just has to be standard for kind of any type of access from the outside. Just any kind of secure account secure account, which would be like any user who's accessing something with a lot of healthcare information, absolutely has to be using MFA at this day and age. And then the third, I would say, is that patching remains it's like the trench warfare of fighting cybercrime. Patching is hard work, particularly with medical devices and out-of-date OSs and all this stuff. But keeping your devices patched is one of the most kind of important things that you can do. There's tons more, but those are three things that, people in our audience can kind of take back and say, at my organization, is information security separate from IT? Number one, are we using MFA? And let's be serious about making sure we're doing everything we can to patch things.
Thank you very much. This has been a terrific conversation. Really appreciated it. And we appreciate your time today, Jim. Thanks.
Thanks, Jason. It's been a pleasure.
SIIMCast has been brought to you by the Society of Imaging Informatics in Medicine. Please visit our website at SIIM.org for more information and educational content, including webinars and an archive of prior episodes. Please follow us on Twitter at sim_tweets. Thank you to our listeners for your continued support.